Hello everyone, Scientier here, and welcome to my life and channel update for September 2023. And it's been a fairly eventful month. For one thing on the channel, there was the, I could not figure out what to name it, but the review of Mr. Jack's proposed Guild Wars 1 Warrior rework. I don't know. Trying to figure out a name for that was challenging, but I'm glad people have been enjoying that video. Mostly subscribers have seen it, but it's done a lot better than I was expecting. I was expecting like a dozen people, maybe, like a dozen views maybe, but it's done way better than that. So thank you, and I'm glad you have seemed to be enjoying it. Audience member. I do appreciate that. So yeah, that was a hefty recording time, sitting down and recording that long thing. I don't know if there's going to be any more of those. I know Mr. Jack has done some updates based on the video, but I'm not planning on recording like a sequel to that particular one. But maybe if there's other professions, maybe. I don't know. That is no promises anyway. That's kind of who knows what the future holds territory. For me, a lot of what I've been working on this month is too many article ideas. Really is what it comes down to. I've got 4-ish articles in the works at various stages. One is almost done. I'm at the like little bit of final polishing on it phase. So I don't know. At the time of this recording, my clock says it's 2:06, but I also know my clock is a couple minutes fast. PM on Tuesday, the 26th of September. When I'm recording this, it's like almost done, so maybe I'll finish it up after this and get it up. That remains to be seen. I wrote a poem. I have another idea for a poem. It's been a lot of writing focus, which has meant that a lot of my mental energies have gone towards that rather than working on my game. So that's just, I can only do so many things simultaneously. One of those things that's really tricky is, I don't know if you experience this, but months have this weird thing in my head where when we're getting towards the end of it, I'm like, wait, how is it almost the end of this month already? But then when I try to think back to the start of the month, I'm like, that was a really long time ago. And I had this problem when I recorded the last one of these in, I guess, August. Feels like it's been absolute ages since I've recorded one of these, and yet I'm like, wait, how is this month almost over? Weren't we just ending August? But no, it was like having a really hard time remembering whether stuff earlier on in the month, as in before like 2 weeks ago, was this month or the previous month. Time is weird. Our memories of events and how they get categorized with time is super strange. It's very, very weird. But at some point within the past little while, I was experimenting around with damage formulas. I think I labeled one of these videos talking about damage formula ramblings. But I settled on a formula that I want to try and spent some time working out numbers. One of the things actually that I should really mention is in one of the previous videos when I was talking about Astria getting into the quagmire that I seem to always run into. It's actually a very big quagmire with a lot of different parts. So I find my way around, and I think I've found my way around the quagmire, and then I walk in another bit of it. But where one of the things that I'm trying to get better and better at is listening to my emotions, because my emotions are telling me something. And I found myself stalling out with part of the design when I was trying to figure out stuff with armor, with the game that I'm working on now. And I realized, okay, I need to step back because I'm not in production right now. I'm in pre-production with it. I'm trying to spend a lot more time just intentionally planning stuff out ahead of time. So because RPG Maker MV structure is very unfriendly to reworks. Like, you can do it, but there's a lot of things you can do in RPG Maker MV that maybe it's a bit tedious. Maybe it's a bit challenging to do. So anyway, I've been my brain was just spouting off to another like 3 directions there. But I've been doing a process whereby I was like, okay, why is my emotional reaction to these things thus? And what helped me realize, because I was working with this plan, just to kind of explain where I was thinking of, okay, these different characters are going to be able to wear different armors, and I have a plugin for RPG Maker MV that I wrote ages ago that lets you have different appearances for different armors that I was going to use. I might still use, but in a slightly different way. But there's going to be like, okay, I'm figuring out these different armor classes that I want to use, and I have to worry about sprite equivalencies between these. So like, what is the plate mail sprite like? Because RPG Maker MV, I'm going to use the character generator for that. Obviously, I'm using RPG Maker MV because I want to use the assets that come with it. But the equivalents, like, there's some stuff that's like armor pieces that have an equivalent between male and female, and then there's some that don't. And so it's like, okay, how do I want to try to manage things for handling where there might or might not be equivalences? And it kind of spirals into a bit of a headache. And I think that's probably what was particularly piquing me. But my plan was that different armors would have a different weight, and then different characters would have different capacity for weight, and weight would cut into your agility, which would then hamper your ability to like go first and dodge and stuff. And so anyway, what I'm like, okay, but this system doesn't actually contribute as much to Buildcraft as I would like, because ultimately you're probably going to want to either use the stuff that's going to provide you the most defense in whichever way that works out. And so it's just like, I think this system is a lot of work for very little actual gain. And so I'm like, oh, why do this? So that was something where I had to think about what was the system actually accomplishing, and I needed to listen to my emotions that were basically like saying, this is going to be way too much work for not enough payoff, is more or less what I think I was subconsciously reacting to, where the emotions were bubbling up of like, I don't want to work on this. I'm like, okay, why don't I want to work on this? I was like, oh, okay, because this doesn't actually do much for me, and it big headache for very little gain. So the part that I like about it is I like different armor value properties, but I can just do that with a separate type of equip item that then sidesteps this whole problem, basically. So that's something that's important to talk about. So yeah, work on the game. I've done some important figuring things out, continuing to figure out how the lore fits together. So many like little, like, when you're doing world building, there are a couple of ways to go about it. There are the people who can kind of just be like, we want to do these things and not really care about the consequences. And then there's people like me who think about, or want to think about, what are the broader ramifications of doing this, and how does this affect everything? And that takes a lot of sitting around waiting for your subconscious to like pull stuff up, or talking with people who also have the same level of compulsion as you. My sister has more actually than I do. She's really good at identifying corner cases, and just ramifications of things. So like on that note, I really like the Lewis McMaster Bejeweled Vorkosigan Saga series, which I'm looking at a bookshelf over there. I have the companion book. My sister has the actual series, but I have the companion book talking about like the details and stuff. But I really like that book series because it's thoughtful world building, but also very thoughtful, like, okay, how does the presence of this technology, like, how is this going to interact with human society? And how is human society going to interact with the existence of one of the big ones is the uterine replicator, aka an artificial womb. And how does this affect society and the ramifications of, so she's very good at thinking about how various technologies and how society would more realistically use them. Because, like, see, here's the thing, right? As a designer, you come up with something that's an idea, and then you see how, like, the way that you think it works, like, that's how you use it, but that's not how people interact with it. So a really good, like, I don't know if it's a good example, but the first example that comes to my mind is with the gacha mechanic from Magic the Gathering. It's an older one, Unhinged, I think, but it's one of the silver bordered mechanics, so it's not something that you see in normal gameplay. It's for a special sort of like joke set. And they had a series of cards with this gacha mechanic, which was when your opponent said a thing or did a thing, you could say gotcha and return the card to your hand. So there was, there was a damage spell that was like damage and guy or whatever. There's a bunch of different ones that were for like common phrases that people would say in Magic. And they at Wizards of the Coast were like, oh, this is a fun mechanic where you're just, you're joking, having a good time, and every now and then you like catch somebody and it creates a laugh or whatever. They had an idea of how it would operate. But the actual way to play it, because players are going to optimize, right? Not every player is going to... Different players optimize towards different things. But there's going to be plenty of players who are going to try to optimize for not getting got by the gotcha mechanic, which means that they're going to be silent. So instead of this being a jokey, fun thing, it made everybody clam up and say nothing. Because you don't get gotcha'd if you're quiet. Which meant that it wasn't having its intended gameplay effect. And it wasn't considered. So there's a lot of times where there's going to be mechanics that the game developers, and this is Magic the Gathering or any game, right? Any game is going to fall into this, where the developer's like, this is how this mechanic is meant to be used, and then they play test it knowing how it's meant to be used, and not how, like, its actual possibility space. So there's a lot of things that can kind of fall into that, where you don't really account for the breadth of how things are going to be used as a designer, and that can run you into a lot of problems. So when you're doing world building and thinking about like technological advancements and things like that, you're going to be thinking about like, oh, I meant for them to use this thing this way, and there we go, that's the way that they use it, and not the breadth of possible applications. So that's something that she was really good at in the Vorkosigan saga, is considering more of the breadth of application that people are going to potentially do with this, and how are they going to try to exploit it to their own advantage and things like that as well. Many words to say that one of the things that I am needing to do and doing with this world building is coming up with systems and then having to have that percolate some to realize, oh, these are the ramifications of this. So as a good example, I've been dealing with the magic system in my RPG and thinking about, okay, here is how mana works, and then there's ramifications from that that affect all sorts of things. And I've tweeted about this a little bit. And one of the things I'm debating right now is how many things should I be talking about openly now, or versus like what becomes spoilers. And I don't think world building stuff should be spoilers. So the idea here is that mana comes from inside things, but when animals die, the mana within their bodies crystallizes. Like, this is where crystallized mana comes from, which has a lot of other important applications. But what it means is that everybody has to be vegetarian, because you can't eat mana dust. It's not a nutrient, right? And so, like, because animals dying produces, like, it turns them into mana dust, there's no meat available to eat. It doesn't exist. And then that got me thinking, okay, but a lot of crafting materials, particularly when you look at the icons in RPG Maker MV, are animal parts. Things like feathers and teeth and claws and bones and whatever. Can those exist? Well, if the body is crystallizing at death, okay, is there blood in these? Can you get these things individually? So like shearing sheep that's fine. You can have wool. But what about feathers? And that sent me into a whole research thing about feathers, and antlers and horns, and it be complicated. There's a whole development stage to feathers. They start off with blood and then don't have blood in them. It's just anyway. So going deep into trying to figure out, okay, what are the full consequences of what happens with mana in this setting, and just anyway, it affects all sorts of parts of different things. So that's something I've been thinking about some. And then articles, I mentioned that. Other things that have been going on. I've been watching season 2 of Wheel of Time. No spoilers here. I'm not going to discuss anything more. But I've been watching that on Amazon Prime with my sister and enjoying it. Curious to see where they go. After the first season came out, she read through the books and has mixed opinions. So it's always kind of interesting to hear some of the comparison thoughts from her on that. And then I've been playing more Guild Wars 2. It's really good that they added Season 1 back in. Wow, is that important? Living World Season 1. For those who aren't 100% sure what I'm talking about, just quickly recap. They decided to try to do this thing where the game world would change over time. Cool idea. The problem is that needs to be really player-driven. It's not something like... It's something where basically the players have to be building the world in order to make that kind of work, where you don't have an ongoing narrative, right? You just have kind of like how people are born into the world and they become part of history, right? That's what happens with us. You kind of need the game world to do the same sort of thing, where the player just like enters in wherever the world is in at that point in time, and just joins in the greater course of the world's history. Because if you're trying to tell an individual story, then you're setting things up in those stages. So that's what happened. They set things up in those previous stages that then you couldn't replay Living World Season 1 because of how they implemented it. And they realized that that's a problem. So starting with Season 2, they made it so that way players could replay it. So it's a different structure, but that meant Season 1 was like this missing narrative block and a really important bit of narrative linkage between the end of the core game, the core story, and Living World Season 2 and the entire rest of the story that comes after that. So you're missing like this block that sets up a bunch of characters and relationships and all sorts of stuff. It is hugely important narratively. And so they added a bit, as I understand, kind of a little bit abridged, but like an actual playable thing to go over the important parts of Living World Season 1. So I played through that, and boy, that was really, really good for them to add back in. So I am very grateful that they were finally able to do that like a decade later. Roughly. 8 years, a decade, something like that. I don't know. A long time later is my point. So I'm currently in this playthrough of the story in Heart of Thorns, but I've been distracted by weeklies and dailies and stuff. Have very mixed feelings about those systems, by the way. I think it's nice to have reward structures in the game like that for players, but it also kind of makes you feel like you need to show up and do specifically the things to do those, and there's some complications with that. But I've overall continued to enjoy the game. The elite specializations are significantly more interesting to play, just as a general principle, than core, like without the elite specializations. And I think that there's a couple of things that they could do to really help address that. One of the big ones is if there was some sort of benefit to not using an elite specialization that could be gained somehow, beyond just the trait line that you would be replacing the elite specialization with. But something else that I think could help is just a bit of a revamping of some of the utility skills, especially the elites. I feel like a lot of the elites are very underwhelming. And a lot of the special racial skills, I understand that they don't want... Like, this is one of the weird things about playing Guild Wars 2, is they don't want you to have to care about what race, because there's 5 playable races for those who aren't familiar. There's human, Sylvari, which is basically human-sized, Norn, which are like giants, Char, which also tend to be bigger, kind of between human and Norn in size, I mean, it depends. There's a bit of overlap uh, in terms of like height, space, and then Asura, which are your short. Um, I don't know, imps as people compare them to, but they're shorter. But they don't want there to be any real mechanical difference between the different races, so that way people don't feel like, oh, if you play X profession, you have to play it as this to play it optimally or whatever. I understand completely. Build prejudice is real. It has real consequences to how people play the game, and trying to balance it so that way there's something good about each profession race combination would be a big undertaking, and I understand why they would not want to do that. Like they had a lot of problems in Guild Wars 1 with build stuff and build prejudice and all sorts of things for like getting groups and stuff. So it's 100% understand the concern. It does mean that there's this weird, because the game's like designed around the human size. So it creates this weird thing where when you're playing a Norn or like a bigger Char, you feel really slow because your legs, like your movement animations can't be faster than a human, right? It's the same movement speed as a human, same jump height as a human. So it feels like you're just physically inept relative to a human in terms of like, because you're being the same as a human, but it just feels very weird. But Asura also feel like super fast and like springy because they need to have the same jump height as a human and the same move speed, but they're shorter and smaller. So it's like the fact that the same movement speed for everything has these weird knockoff consequences. Again, I completely understand why, but it feels very strange. But there's also racial skills. So humans have prayers to their gods, which are an important part of their stuff, and gets elaborated on over the course of the Guild Wars 2 story, and perhaps more in the future. We'll see. That'd be interesting. The Char have a lot of stuff with their warband and technology. Asura have some plant-related skills. Norn have, like, the Norn have their become the animal thing, which was a huge deal in the story in Guild Wars 1, because the Norn were introduced in the Eye of the North expansion for Guild Wars 1, and it's a huge part of their story, the becoming the bear. Like, it's absolutely an enormous part of their story, and they expanded it with become bear, snow leopard, raven, and wolf forms with Guild Wars 2. But because they're because they're racial skills rather than profession skills, they have to be utter garbage. So that way they're not the best skill you could use, like the meta thing to do. It would be really nice if they could bump these racial skills up, so that way they're not just literally the worst skill choices you could make for any given build. That it would be like reasonable to maybe do them sometimes and have fun with them. It'd be cool to see some Norn actually use those shape-shifting skills. Anyway, a lot of the core profession elites feel very weak to me, and it would be really nice to see those tuned up to feel usable, to feel good to use. I'm hopeful that one of the things that they're doing with Secrets of the Obscure is they're not adding another elite specialization. So normally expansion packs have come with an elite specialization, so they've had to focus a lot of the development resources on that. They're adding more weapons, though, which I think is a good direction to go, because that's a simpler, more contained way of adding stuff. But I hope that they they have managed to free themselves up of some resources that'll, in terms of like balance and skill design and stuff, to be able to go back and address some of those things to particularly make the core experience better. Like, I hope they open up some opportunity to go back and polish up the core story stuff a bit, where there's potentially some spots that are a bit wonky and things like that, but also just to make some of those like core elite skills more interesting. Like they did some revamps to a couple of them, like with Guardian. They cut out some really clunky elites and they replaced them with ones that feel way more playable. There's a whole thing that I could rant about, like how Warcraft 3 hero design inspired the design of Guild Wars 2's stuff with the way Ultimates worked then through MOBAs, and how that cemented the idea and then we get that ultimate style of elite skill in Guild Wars 2, rather than like Guild Wars 1 elite skills were all over the map of like bar compression, so they're more efficient to use. So that way you could bring it in the elite skill instead of like 2 other skills, versus like unique build around me's like Warrior's Endurance. And then you have, I don't know, bigger, flashier effects and things. So it's like the elites were kind of like all over the place in terms of what they did in Guild Wars 1. In what sort of role they filled in a build. And I feel like Guild Wars 2's design, it went with trying to be more of like an ultimate from like a MOBA or a Warcraft 3 hero, which I guess is fine, but you also kind of get into the why have I reached the final dungeon with all these elixirs problem that you get in RPGs, where like you hoard your consumable items. It feels like, oh, this thing has like a 3-minute recharge. Guess I don't want to use it until I really need it, and then you don't really need it enough to ever use it, sort of thing. And that's a problem with a lot of the original designs for them. So a lot of for elite skills and a lot of the elite specializations are better on that front. Some other random Guild Wars 2 thoughts. The crafting system continues to be the part of the game I like least. Grinding up the levels in order to be able to make relevant things is really tedious and terrible, and I find it really funny that they added research kits as a way to kind of like recognize that fact that you just have to make a lot of like trash, or like not even trash, but like you just need to make a lot of middle ground stuff in order to get to the point where you can make the stuff that you really want to make. So now you can spend turn those resources into another resource. But now you have to make research notes for things, and it's just like this whole system is so grindy and tedious, and like I understand you're stuck with it because you designed it initially and now it's what you've got. But the worst part of it, in my opinion, are the time-gated craftings. That feels super bad to be like, oh, you can only craft one of these a day. It's like, why can I only craft one of these a day? Just because. And yeah, it just feels terrible to me. I don't like it. Like, it's one of those things that this is really, really interesting. So resource nodes you can only harvest from once a day. That feels fine to me. Only able to craft one of these things a day feels terrible to me. And I find that really interesting. Where one feels like the underpinning grounding why that's the case just feels better to me, of like, oh, of course, I've depleted this resource. But with the crafting one, is like, why can I only craft one of these a day? What is the explanation? Like, there's no Watsonian explanation. It's just a Doylist one of like, we don't want you to make too many of these a day. For whatever reason. We're limiting this for some reason. There's some Doylist explanation. For those who haven't heard Doylist versus Watsonian just means in-universe explanation. Doylist means author explanation. It comes from Sherlock Holmes, where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was the author of the books, but in-universe, John Watson is the author. So it's like, what is the in-universe explanation? So the Watsonian in-universe author explanation, or explanation for things, versus the Doylist, why did the actual author write it this way? So it's a useful set of terms if you've never heard those before. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is I've been watching a lot of StarCraft 2 pro matches. I don't know, there's some series, ESL I think it was, like tournament that I've just been watching this whole tournament. It's from like the summer, but it's on YouTube. I've been watching it, and so I've been developing a lot of thoughts about StarCraft 2 of like what would make this. One of the things basically that annoys me is it feels like a lot of the games play out with the same sort of patterns, where it's like, oh, Blink Stalkers and Bio Balls for Terran, or Zerglings/Banelings plus Roaches/Ravagers for Zerg. This feels like Zerg tends to be a little bit better about having a little bit more nuance in some of the unit composition strategies going on. It's really interesting to me that's like Protoss feels like the most popular race, and then Zerg, and then Terran in terms of players. But I'm sure there's many reasons for that. But it's like, I'm a little tired of seeing Bio Balls from Terran or mass Blink Stalkers from Protoss. And it's one of those things where I've been thinking about, okay, like, the other thing that I've like, what could they do to try to address that, to make it so that way there's reasons why people would want to do more divergent builds and things like that. I've been thinking a lot of or I've been thinking some about a lot of different potential paths that you could do to try to do things about that, but nothing like super like it. The ideas that I have are things where, why would you want to do this or that, right? So different paths of development where you can't do everything, and so you have to pick what you're doing. And there's like, that's in the game in a sort of soft way of like, okay, maybe you shouldn't spend the resources on doing this thing because you could use those resources somewhere else better. But I don't know. It would be nice to not have the same patterns play out, and to have things that like can maybe punish going for specific patterns to where you need to change things up. I don't know. Again, there's a lot of like theory craft level versus what actual the practical implementation is. And the other thing is, I just really don't like disruptors. Like, as a unit, they're way too swingy. Either the opponent has like it's one of these things. Okay, so there's this idea of micro, which is being able to control at the micro level individual units really well. And you can get a lot of edges that way because they operate off of an AI. You tell them broadly, like, move here, do this, attack this thing. But if you're able to put the focus into specifically controlling your units, you can get a lot more value out of them. And disruptors are a unit that sends out this energy ball that explodes and does a lot of damage, but if you kill the disruptor first, then the energy ball dissipates instead of doing damage. Disruptors are an incredibly powerful, or they have a lot of potential power, but you can micro and split your units to greatly mitigate their power. So it's this really tight micro game with disruptors. So they basically either can get a ton of value if your opponent, for example, is looking away to do something somewhere else in the map for a moment, or if they don't know that a disruptor is coming, or if they're just not as skilled of a player or whatever. They can potentially have a lot of value, but they can also just like do nothing or very little. And if like the other person jumps on the disruptor and kills it first before the shot goes off or whatever. I think that the design of the disruptor is very, very swingy, where either it completely digs you out of a hole that you've fallen into, so it takes you from being behind to being ahead, or it does stone nothing, or effectively nothing. And kind of, I guess, the neutral place is a little bit of a zoning tool, but it's way too swingy, and it feels like the upside cases are too much upside and the downside cases are too much downside for the unit. So I don't like how it plays, at least as an observer. Yeah. The other thing that's really interesting to me is it feels like in StarCraft 2 they really make air units like not good at attacking down. So like, or if they can attack down well, it's a very limited capacity, or they're a very expensive unit. So it's like either your capital ships like battle cruisers and carriers, or it's like, oh, Oracle can technically attack down but in a limited fashion, or Phoenix can lift things, so it's limited fashion, or Vikings or Liberators have to like change in an alternate mode, sort of thing. Where it feels like they don't want things attacking down well, and I think that's really interesting. It preserves the importance of the geography of the map, but because flying units can ignore it, right? But it also means it affects some of the counterplay and things like that, and also limits like unit diversity. Like you only see void rays in an emergency. Like if a Protoss unit makes a void ray, you know it's because they think they are not doing well, because they would rather not make one. So it's just that, to me, I would like to see something a bit different there too. I don't know. There's just a lot of different thoughts boiling around, but it's interesting to think about what is the design and what are they trying to accomplish with it, and what might their goals be, and different people are going to come to the metagame differently and stuff like that. So I don't know. There's just some random thoughts on that. I've probably gone long enough. This is a little over half an hour, approaching 35 minutes. So thank you all very much for watching. Until next month, take care, everyone. Goodbye.